Hello, welcome to Racers360.com. My name's Mike Edwards, and we're going to talk about the Brands Hatch GP circuit in the UK. To help with the guide, I'm going to drop in aerial shots, circuit maps, etc., showing the line, approach line, apexes, and so on. And the line itself is going to be in different colours to show what I'm actually doing on the line at that point in time. Red will indicate braking area. Yellow will be just a closed throttle. Orange will be where I either pick the throttle up or part throttle, and green is where I'm genuinely accelerating and onto the straights, etc. The circuit itself, the GP circuit itself, is the layout using the Indy circuit or the short circuit and an extra loop out into the countryside, creating the GP circuit. We're going to cover the GP circuit because, to be honest, it's one of my favourite circuits in the UK. It's steeped in history. The circuit, as most of the corners will be named after Formula One car drivers and motorcycle stars from the past. I'm going to use the corner names and the corner number to help everybody out so we know where we are on the track. The circuit itself has a huge elevation change. It's one of the big things of Brands Hatch is if the circuit's going up and down and cresting rises and dropping into dips, and creates a tremendous atmosphere in itself. It's got a few bumpy sections as well, and there's a few surface changes which can be problematic, shall we say, from time to time. A lot of the corners also are multi-apex corners, and there's I've described them as 10 separate corners, but there's probably, if you add all the kinks together, you're probably up to closer to 15. So I'm trying to simplify it, so we're using 10 corners, and we'll talk about the kinks as opposed to a separate corner. Okay, running over the start-finish line to turn 1, Paddock Hill, or turn 1, is one of the most awesome corners you're likely to ever encounter. It's a very high-speed approach. The straight itself, running down towards turn 1 through the start-finish area, is called Bramham Straight. And you're approaching effectively a rise in the circuit, and then as you're approaching the apex, the circuit drops very steeply down into the bottom, and that's called Paddock Hill. Crossing the start-finish line, we want to be over to the left-hand side of the track, and full gas as we're approaching the start-finish line itself, which is just here, and the start marshal boxes to our right. At this point in time, we're actually keeping over to the left, so we're in the best position because we're obviously coming to a right-hander. We're looking now for our braking reference, and on a superbike or a stock 1000, which I'm on here, we're looking for this gantry tower here on the right. So as we're approaching that point, we'll come into the braking area, and the brake light here will show us that we're now braking. Now we're going up a slight rise, and the first of the kinks I talked about starts here. There's a slight kink before we actually get to Paddock Hill itself, the corner. Because we're actually braking really hard at this point, we want to try and keep the bike up while we're braking. And it's one of the reasons during this point, we're over to the left-hand side of the track. At this point in time, we're now looking for this marshal post in the distance. That's our aim point. And the reason for that is largely because if you stay on the left-hand side of the track, our braking is effectively round that curve. Where if we depart from the left-hand side of the track and aim for that marshal's post, our braking is much more upright. And because of the curve of the circuit, we will eventually meet the edge of the track again over the rise. So our aim point is that marshal's post. Extremely heavy braking at this point. And again, we're aiming for that marshal's post. As you can see, we're starting to pull away towards the middle of the track. This is one of the highest points of the circuit. We're effectively going over a rise. What we're looking for now is our tipping point, or the point where we have to commit to the corner itself. So we're actually looking now for this 100 meter or 1 mark, which is going to be our tipping point. As we're approaching that, there's a few things which can help us here. We're still doing 120, 130 miles an hour as we're getting to this point. So the corner's really starting to come at you. And because of the rise, we still can't see the corner. So you really need to be very positive and confident where you are on the track at this point and be proactive to know what you need to do before you get there. So we're looking for the 100-meter mark here, and the blend line out of the pits comes in from our right here. Now, as we're getting towards the 1 mark, where we have to really start to commit, because this is, from this point onwards, is where the corner genuinely really starts. So we have to be in the right place to commit our entry into the corner. Now, at this point of the track, it seems very obvious and very easy, and you can get sucked in if you start to panic a little bit, to cross this blend line to get us towards where we think our apex is. However, the apex itself is an awful long way around the corner still. It's almost halfway down the hill itself towards Paddock Hill Bottom. So what our aim here is to keep on out towards the marshal's post, and we want to then start our turn. So if you look at where the blend line is and the edge of the tarmac, roughly in the middle of that is our ideal point to get a nice late apex down the hill. So as we're approaching that point, you can see now by the angle of lean, the bike's committed to the corner. Now, because of the corners started and the drop itself is really starting to steepen up now, we're actually starting to drop downhill. From the voice of experience here, it's quite easy if you hang onto the brake too long for the front end to fold, because effectively with us going over the rise, we're starting to lose a little bit of weight. So you really need at this point to be easing back on the brake. You can trail it for a while, but you really need to get off the brake. So as we're starting to close in on our right-hand curb here, the apex still hasn't come into view effectively for us. As we're closing the right-hand curb, off the brakes and leave the throttle closed and allow the bike to turn in towards what is the apex. Now you can see the bottom of the dip here, so that's our ultimate aim point, but we're still looking for the apex of the corner, which is roughly where these two splodges of concrete are, just the other side of the curb. Now the curbs at Brands aren't very wide, and generally speaking aren't very good to use. I would suggest stay off them to a large degree. The exception is the bottom of the hill here. You can run across that one, and the one coming out of Graham Hill Bend, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Now at this point, we're on effectively the steepest part of the hill, right at the apex of the corner, and this is the point where I would suggest to start picking up the throttle to just balance the bike up, take a bit of weight off the front wheel, get some weight on the back wheel to get the bike nice and steady, because the next thing we're going to start to do is try and accelerate down the hill. Now you can't go full gas at this point because the bike is still quite light on its feet, and it feels like you're sort of slithering about at this point, desperate for grip. So feed the throttle on progressively, and by the time you get to the bottom of the dip here, we should be pretty much on full gas. Now in the bottom of the dip, you feel what happens here is because you've gone into the bottom of a dip and then you start to go at Pilgrim's Rise up to turn 2. What you find here is the bike bottoms out, the tyres get squashed, you run back to the bottom of the suspension, and the bike feels like you've hit like a patch of ice, and the bike feels like it slithers around some. Nothing to worry too much about, keep it pinned. We're now going to start running up the hill, Pilgrim's Rise, up towards turn 2. Now, it's not dead straight, there is another slight kink halfway up the hill, so we're looking for the parapet, the bridge here, and we want to be going under the left-hand side of the bridge as our approach into Druids, which is turn 2. But first of all, we're looking for our braking reference. And our braking reference coming up the hill here is the end of the Armco barrier and this orange section of Armco just here. Now, because of the kink, we're right up against the curb in the bottom of the dip here. But because of this kink going up the hill, we can come away a little bit from the left-hand curb as we pass this point. But we want to drift back over to the left as we hit the brakes and go under the bridge. So look for the brake light coming on here, and we're now braking hard under the bridge. Druids is a long 180-degree second or third gear corner, depending on what you're actually riding. And because of the duration that you're in the corner, there isn't one specific apex. So what you need to do is get yourself into the corner, hold on to the apex curve for a period of time, and then look for a reference point that you can leave the curb and start to come out the corner. Another interesting thing about Druids is we're still going up quite a steep hill up Pilgrim's Rise here, but while we're on the brakes, just after we go under the bridge is where we start our tip in into the corner, still braking hard at this point. And as we're starting to close in on the right-hand curb, it's only at that point that the corner really starts to come into view. And actually, you come onto like a plateau, it flattens out, which creates yet another little bit of a rise. And that's right at the point, again, if you hang on to the brake for too long or too hard, because of the rise, you can end up tucking the front again. So it's quite important to trail brake coming into this corner and back off the brakes as you're starting to close in on the right-hand curb. The end of the arco here is definitely, you need to be off the brakes at that point, because the rise itself has finished at this point and you're onto the plateau. So once you're closing in on the curb, keep the throttle closed so you can get onto your racing line that you want. And when you feel you've slowed enough and you're comfortable, pick the throttle up to maintain your pace around the corner. Hang onto the curb for a while. And then if you try to accelerate too early out of this corner, you're just going to dash off to the left-hand side of the track and completely destroy your exit. So a little bit of patience is required here. And what we're actually looking for, we should now be looking down the track, and we're looking for the end of this solid curve here. It narrows down, so you've got a fat part and then it narrows down, and we're looking for the end of that. As soon as that comes into view, that's your indicator to start developing the throttle out the corner. Now, we should be looking for that point, but we should also be looking as far down the track as we can for the drift out curve. It's always a good idea to look where you want to go, not where you're particularly pointed. So as we start to come out the corner, we can start to let the curb go, and we're now looking down here for these orange markers, and they give you an idea, particularly the second one, of where our drift out point should be. So running out the corner now, developing the throttle more and more and more, and you can use all of the track right out to the outside here. Now we're dropping down the hill, Pilgrim's Hill effectively, or Pilgrim's Rise, and it's quite steep downhill, so the bike will accelerate really quickly because of the hill. Our aim point now is ultimately the middle of this tipping curb down at the bottom of the hill. That's our tipping curb into Graham Hill. There's a few things about it. It's very difficult at this point to get the bike over to the right-hand side of the track, to actually be on the right-hand side of the track approaching that point. So it's a little bit of a compromise. What I tend to find here is get the bike out into the middle of the track and then aim for the center of that, or the middle of that drift out curb. If you stay too long down this side of the track, potentially it's slightly better on the brakes, but it makes Graham Hill curve even longer than it is. It's only a 90-degree corner, but if you approach from the effectively left-hand side of the track, you'll ruin your entry. So it's quite important to get the bike out to the middle of the track. Don't try and get all the way out to the right, middle of the track, and then as you hit the brakes, then allow the bike to drift out to that point. Dropping down the hill. These orange markers, which this is a tyre wall here, and as we're coming to this point, just before you get to this point, we're aiming, remember, for the centre of that short curb here. That's our aim point. So our line now should be relatively straight for that point, and then tip in from there. One of the advantages now, from at the middle of the track here, we can brake with the bike as upright as possible, more or less in a straight line. If you've spent a lot of time getting over to the right-hand side of the track, effectively your braking once again is that sort of curved braking, which isn't as efficient as this straight line braking that we're doing at this point. So heavy braking, running out towards the right-hand side of the track, and more or less as soon as you reach the curb here, use that as the tipping point. You don't follow the curb for any length of time. More or less as soon as you get there, you tip in. And effectively, you're actually tipping in to the corner before you get to the curb. So this is almost part of the curb. Apex of Graham Hill there's only a short curb here, and it's roughly halfway around the curb. You'll see two small concrete splodges just the other side of the red and white curb, and that's the apex itself. Now the track also levels out here and flattens out onto a very, very slight rise going up Cooper Straight. So effectively you get a small amount of compression on the bike, not a lot, just as you're arriving at the apex of the corner. As you're rolling into this corner, try and get rid of the brakes, pick up the throttle as you're closing in the apex, because it's quite important, because of this straight we're coming onto, to get a really good exit out of here and carry plenty of exit speed. So sometimes compromising your entry to get a really good exit is a good ploy. The downside to that, of course, is if you're in traffic and leading a group of riders, if you're too slow into this corner, you're going to get people darting underneath you. So it depends on a lot of tactical riding, what you're wanting out of this corner. The curb itself is usable, but it's quite bumpy. And if you go the other side of it, there's some plastic meshing pushed into the ground. And you can run on it, but it's like being on the grass. It's very, very, very slippy. So I would suggest you use the curb at best. Now we're coming on to, we've gone round Graham Hill Bend there, which is turn 3. We're heading up now, up Cooper Straight towards a corner called Surtees, which is turn 4. This is Cooper Straight, but as you can see by it, it's actually a long curve. So from our drift out point here, our next aim point is our braking point, which is quite a long way down the straight along this barrier here. So I would suggest at this point we try and straight line that as much as we can, as opposed to feel like the temptation to run round the outside, following the edge of the track. Now the reason for that is braking again, because at some point as we're approaching our braking point, we want to be as upright as we can so we can do a much harder, more condensed amount of braking. Where if we're going around a slight curve at the time with an angle of lean, the further over we are, the more you're effectively running a risk of having issues with the bike lent over. So keeping the bike upright, or as upright as you can at this point, is pretty important. Running down past the paddock is to our right hand side, and the back of the pit boxes and so on is here. And we're now looking for our braking point into turn 4, which is Surtees. So we've brought our bike over towards the right hand side of the track in as upright as we can, and somewhere in between the 2 and the 1 marker is our braking reference. So again, because we're nearly upright, big squeeze of brakes. Now it's almost flat. It's a very, very slight incline here, but it's effectively flat as we're approaching the corner. And turn 4 Surtees is where the Indy circuit turns right and the GP circuit turns left. So there's a definite division. And as we go off to the left, we go up another steep climb, which will come on to Pilgrim's Drop, ultimately on the exit of Surtees. And it's a very steep hill again. The incline itself is just out of view, the other side of these barriers here. But the corner itself is extremely long. So the temptation here, and I've done it myself, is at this point is to make our way over to the left-hand side of the track. The best line here is staying out for as long as you can. It feels like you've almost missed your corner entry. The payoff is you get a much higher ultimate apex speed and a much better exit onto the straight. So running into the corner, braking hard, easing back at the further over we're getting, and eventually you'll need to ease back completely and just leave the throttle closed and allow the bike to start to close in towards what is the apex. Now the Indy circuit goes off in front of you here, down the Indy circuit. We're going now is apexing around this corner and up the hill. So your eye can be slightly confused at this point by where the tarmac's going, but you've got to make a mental note of where going left. Sounds obvious, but I've seen people get dreadfully confused at this point. Now, apex of the corner here, you'll see there's a line here going across the circuit, which goes all the way across the Indy circuit as well. Just on or around that point is the tightest part of the apex curve, and I would suggest that's the point that you get to. This is where the hill really starts. So at this point, even though we feel we want to start accelerating, it's still a little bit early to start accelerating because the corner carries on for quite a long way. You've already gone round quite a lot of it, but there's still a lot of it to go. But the incline here will be killing your speed. So you can't just stay on a closed throttle all the way around here, because otherwise you're just going to fall into the curve on the left and lose too much speed. So towards the end of this curve, pick the throttle up to maintain a bit of pace. And as we're leaving the end of this curb, start to develop the throttle out and up over the rise. Now, our aim point is slightly out of sight in between the two trees here, and that's the end of the drift out curve. If your aim point is here, what you'll find is when you get to that point, if you started to sit the bike up now, for instance, and make your way out there, you would very quickly run into the edge of the curve because you can't see the drift out curve because of the incline. As we start to get towards it, it pops into view. So it's one of the reasons from the end of this curve here on the left, we look for the gap in the trees, and that's effectively our aim point. It's important to look there because that's where you want to go. So as we're coming out of the corner, up onto the short straight, which goes around another kink, and then a long back straight down Pilgrim's Dock towards turn 5, which is Hawthorns, named after Mike Hawthorn, the F1 racer. Now, the bike here, because you're going over a slight rise, will be desperate to wheelie. So that's one thing you have to keep an eye on and be aware of. It is going to happen at some point. So good throttle control, maybe a little bit of use of back brake. But either way, watch out for the wheelie at this point. Now, there is a slight kink in the straight here, which is just in the distance. Just here, there's a slight kink. Don't worry about it too much. You're going to be flat out down here, but you just have to be aware of it. Don't stay on the right-hand side of the track going up this short section because you're making the kink quite tight then. What I would suggest is drift out towards the middle of the track. You don't need to go over to the left, and that just kind of opens the curve out a little bit. Where if you stay over the right-hand side of the track, it's then a much tighter curve. So coming into the middle of the track, you don't lose that much distance-wise, but you just make the kink less tight. And what it does, if you do stay over the right-hand side of the track, because you're effectively having to turn a tighter corner, you're carrying a bigger angle of lean, and it can make the revs pick up a little bit too fast, and it can cause the back of the bike to start slewing around a little bit. So opening the corner out gives the tyre an easier life. It's just a much better way of doing this section. So round through the kink, the next thing we're looking for is this parapet in the distance, because we're just about to go over another rise. And as we get to this point here, and you can see the track in the distance and the bridge, the bike wants to wheelie again. We're now up to thick end of 160 mile an hour. You're accelerating hard, and the bike often will try and wheelie at this point. So you need to deal with that. Okay, and if you feel comfortable, ease back a little bit on the throttle, or keep your foot over the back brake. But either way, just be aware that there's the potential of the bike will try and wheelie. We're keeping the bike over the left-hand side of the track. Keep flat out under the bridge, and we're now, after you've gone under the bridge, you can see the Hawthorns corner itself in front of you. It's a very, very fast corner. We're going relatively steeply downhill, and from this point in the track is the dip, and then we start to climb all the way around Hawthorns until the exit of Hawthorns, which is way around here somewhere, way in the distance. So we're now looking for our braking reference. Now, again, depends on what you're riding, but on a super bike or a stock bike, stock 1000, which I'm on here, it's approaching the bottom of the dip. You can get more or less to the bottom of the dip where this surface changes. I like to brake a little bit before that, just about the 3 mark, and that allows you to control your entry into Hawthorns. So we're keeping our bike over to the left-hand side of the track. We're right in the bottom of the dip now, pulling it back a few gears. Now Hawthorns is it's only 90 degree, but it's a very long, fast corner. You know, you're well over 100 miles an hour, 100, 110 miles an hour. And once again, it's one of those corners because of your entry speed or your approach speed is your brain is saying get over to the right. So it wants to suck you in here. That creates much too early an apex. Our apex is way, way, way round the corner, out of sight at this point. So what we're looking for is something that we can use as a tip-in reference. Now, what I tend to do here is somewhere between the 2 and the 1, certainly by the 1, I've actually started to commit to the corner and start to get the bike over there. But because of the speed and the radius of the corner, how fast you cross the track here is important. So I would suggest you ease the bike into the corner here and don't try and quickly get over to that right-hand side of the track, because we're looking for quite a late apex to this corner. So what we're trying to do is stay out in the track a little bit and create a much longer, lazier entry into the corner, as opposed to that early dart. Now we're going uphill here, so as you approach the bottom of the dip, it feels like you're not going to stop. And as you're running into the corner, the combination of the brakes, the closed throttle, the engine braking, and the hill are all combining. And because of the length of the corner, after a short amount of, by the time you've reached the end of this Armco here with the oranges, for instance, that's where you want to start picking up the throttle to maintain your pace, because the hill goes all the way around, and right at the exit is where it flattens out. At the apex of the corner is not long after you've passed this Armco barrier here. It's probably another 50 meters or so. Just put an arrow so you can have a little look. It's round about this point on the track. So from here to that point is where we pick the throttle up to maintain our pace. And at this point, because of the incline, and we're effectively going over a rise, we can't quite see our drift out point. Now our aim point, where what we're looking for here, is there's a gap in the trees down here. So our eyes are trying to see this gap in the trees. And as that starts to come into view, as we round the corner, this gap in the trees here, we can start to let go of the curb and develop the throttle out of the corner. And you're more or less about 3/4 of the way out of the corner before finally the drift out curve comes into view. And if you've let go too early or you're traveling too fast, that really does jump out of you. So it's a huge confidence corner. And it's all about that late apex, keeping up your momentum, and then developing the throttle steadily out of the corner. Now it's only a short straight called the Derek Minter straight down here, and we're approaching turn 6. And so you've got a short blast of throttle. And now we're approaching Westfield. Well, Westfield and Dingle Dell, it's two corners which are really close together. And it creates, like, it's actually, if you added Dingle Dell, Westfield, Sheen, and the other little kinks there, it's actually about 4 kinks, which you need to sort of almost put them all together as one curve effectively. We're approaching that point now. So we're looking for a braking reference, which is round about the 2 mark. And there's a surface change here to give you an extra hand. We want to be keeping the bike over to the left-hand side. And we want to ideally create a relatively late tip-in and a slightly later apex, because this corner is the first of 2 kinks. You've got Westfield, and then you're straight dropping into Dingle Dell. So you need to try and create one really progressive curve. It's also extremely bumpy. From the apex onwards, it's very, very bumpy dropping down the hill. So as you go past the first apex, which is approximately just after this short curb here, it's only a short, 25, 30 meter curb. Roughly halfway along it is our apex. So after we pass the 1 mark, that's where we commit to the corner, trailing the brake in towards the apex. But what we want to do is create a nice controlled double apex corner here. And because of the bumps, that's why you need to control this. You want to have the bike nice and stable. So pick up the throttle as you pass this apex, but don't try and accelerate too early. What you need to do, because of the bumps, all these bumps around this section, is let the bike settle over these bumps, run out to right towards the edge of the track here. And now you can start to genuinely accelerate out of the corner. We're now, once again, dropping downhill. These inclines, you really have to watch out for. We're dropping down towards Dingle Dell, which is the bottom of the rise here. This is another slight kink. Dingle Dell, the bottom, is the second of the kinks. So we're now accelerating hard. As we pass this first kink, we want to be almost in the middle of the track. So from here, we want to be in the middle of the track. And as we go to the bottom of the dip, we're out over the left-hand side of the track and then back up the hill. Now this is without question for me the hardest point of the track because it's not clear and the reference points are relatively few at this point. You've got the problem with the bikes dropping down the hill, you're accelerating hard, you've got a lot of wheel spin, There's an awful lot going on at this point. But effectively our aim point is right in the bottom of the dip, is we're aiming for the left-hand side of the track. There's no drift out curb at this point, and I have done it. I've run on the grass at this point, not recommended. So make sure that you stay on the black stuff at this point, because as you can see, that slight kink on the left-hand side of the track. Now, from the bottom of the dip, which is this orange mark in the track here, that's roughly the point where we hit the brakes. Now, what we're aiming to do is to get the bike as upright as possible up to the tipping point. But because of the kink here, if we stayed out to the left-hand side of the track, we effectively would be following that sort of shape, which means our braking would be done at an even bigger angle of lean than trying to straight line it as best we can. So this is our preferred line. So running up the hill, still braking as hard as we can at this point. What we're looking for here is the 100-meter mark and the orange section on the Armco. These are the 2 points which almost immediately you've passed them. Even though the bike is at an angle of lean, you finally commit to the corner. As you can see if I let the video run round this corner, the angle of lean of the bike doesn't change that much. But this is the point just after you've passed the 1 mark where you have to commit to the entry into the corner. Now the apex itself, you can't see at this point. It's literally over another rise, and it's only about 10 feet long. It's a little tiny curb, and it really jumps out at you. So having an aim point is quite difficult as well, because you can't see anything beyond this point other than the trees. So what you have to utilize is the end of the Armco barrier here, the short amount of grass that you can see, and just about in the middle of that is where the apex is going to pop out at you. As you've finally committed away from the left-hand side of the track and you're running in over the rise, you can see the curb comes out to meet you. It's well worth spending quite a lot of time at this corner, getting confidence in running out to the left-hand side of the track and creating a long curve, and it allows you to then create a much higher corner speed. If you've come up the middle of the track here because you don't want to go run to the left, you're then creating a much tighter, effectively a much tighter curve around the corner, where from here our trajectory is so much better and allows you to go through the corner not only faster but safer. Literally as soon as the curb comes into view, pick up the throttle. We've crested the rise more or less, develop the throttle out towards turn 9, which is Sterling. This is Sheen curve that we're going round. Now there's another slight kink in the track here which comes into view, but as long as you've passed that curb, allow the bike to run out towards the edge of the circuit, and by the time we've got to that point, the short straight down to Sterling's comes into view. Now our aim point here is over to the right hand side of the track. Sterling's itself is a nicely cambered, it's a beautiful little corner, 90 degree, quite fast, deceptively fast when you're approaching it, because it's all enclosed by trees. It's one of my favourite corners on the circuit, to be honest. But our aim point now is to get our bike, continue this curve that we're on, to bring it back over to the right hand side, and then we can get the bike upright for a short amount of braking into Surtees. So keeping the bike turning right, bringing it over to the right hand side, and before you've got over to the right hand side, you're into the braking zone, which is roughly between the 2 and the 1, not long after the 2, to be fair. Bringing the bike over to the right, there's no tipping curb here, and I've never quite understood why there isn't a tipping curb, but there isn't. So your reference here really is 100-meter mark here, and then utilize these 2 orange sections here. You've got to, this is a real seat of your pants corner, I'd describe it. Try to resist the temptation to do that early apex, stay out past the 100 mark, and then ease the bike progressively into the corner. The apex curb itself is quite short, so it's fairly easy as you're approaching it to suss out where the apex actually is. As you can see, this is the apex curb itself. It's probably only 5-6 meters long at the longest. So literally it's a little curb which jumps out, and our apex is more or less the center of it. Now, because of the camber here, you've got a really positive camber. It allows you to carry a little bit more speed than you imagine. So literally, as you're running into this corner, trail the brake off, pick the throttle up as you're coming up to the curb, and then develop it from that point out towards the drift out curb. The camber, though, does, as you drift out towards the drift out curb, it hides that drift out curb. So from the apex of the corner, we want to be looking, again, as far up the track as we can. Trying to look down the straight. If you're looking at this point, as you exit the corner, that's where you're going to go. So try and look down the track as far as you can, and then as the curb starts to come up, the track kind of flattens out up onto the straight, which takes you down to Clearways and Clark Curve, which is the final corner. Now this is we're approaching a section next, running slightly downhill towards the Parapet and Clark Curve. This is Clearways, and Clearways is partly the Indy circuit, which joins us down here. So it's partly this straight and partly that curve. So it's Clearways into Clark Curve. This is a time where you can gather your thoughts, because we're approaching a really tricky corner. Again, it's very high speed. You've got cambers, there's an awful lot going on down here. So composure is something you want to be thinking at this point. Either way, what we're looking for at the moment as we're approaching the bridge is our braking reference. Now again, on a superbike, a stock 1000 bike, what we're looking for is there's a service road runs out to the right here, and the bridge itself. Somewhere between these two is our braking reference. Now what we want to be doing is keeping the bike right over to the left hand side of the track, well under the bridge. And this is where this little section here coming in from your right is where the Indy circuit meets us. So we're joining the circuit. Now the Indy circuit gets an awful lot of use and the GP circuit a lot less use. And as you're tipping in here, the surface change is very pronounced. The grip of the GP circuit generally is better. It's not poor grip as you're approaching the apex, but it's just different grip than you've been used to on the rest of the GP circuit. So keeping the bike over to the left-hand side of the track, under the bridge. Clark Curve starts here. This is the end of Clearways, and Clark Curve starts here and runs all the way around, and it's an enormous corner. So you've got, again, there's a lot going on here. You can't quite see at this point the exit of the corner, because from the minute you drop in, from the apex onwards, it drops into a dip and then climbs up over a slight rise up towards the start-finish area again. So keep the bike on heavy brakes, and before you get just after the 100 mark and this gravel road here, start to ease the bike over towards the right-hand side of the track and get off the brakes before you get to the apex. And the reason for that is, as you can see by this surface change here, we're now coming on to what is the Indy circuit. So this section of the track here, the grip is less than it is here. So trail the brakes at best and be off the brakes by the time you reach the end of this fat section of curb. Now, because we're going over a rise here, the bike will feel quite light on its feet, and then it starts to drop down the dip where you start to progressively develop the throttle. So it's particularly important that when you pick the throttle up here, you part throttle it for a short time and then develop the throttle nice and steadily. Give the back tyre and the front tyre to a point and easier life as possible. Now our aim point here is, it's about down there, which is basically the bottom of the dip leading round Clark Curve. That's where we want to be, and we want to be over about 3/4 the way out in the track at that point. So passing the apex, by now we've picked the throttle up, and we're aiming for, there's a white line crosses the track, this is where the pit lane goes in. So this white line here, we want to be about 3/4 out in the track here. You can go right to the outside of the track if you've run particularly hot around this corner. But as we get to this point, we're now accelerating because of the dip. We're in a slight compression, so we've got quite good grip now from the rest of the corner. What we're looking for now is our next aim point. Now the Armco barrier starts about here, and there's a marshal's post just after it. Now the marshal's post ultimately is what we're looking for. It's a much easier thing to see, and we want to be back over to the right hand side of the track by that point. If you've gone right out to the left-hand side of the track using all of the track round clearways, it can sometimes be almost hard work to get the bike back to that point. So it's a little bit of a compromise. It's also extremely ripply. Bumpy is a strong word. I would say there's the ripples going through this section. But because you're going up a hill and then it flattens out and then drops down again slightly, there's effectively a rise, it can really unsettle the bike. So even though you're pretty much flat out over this rise and through this next section, the bike will be moving about a bit. My preferred line around here is almost the middle of the track. Ideal line is quite close to the marshal's post as you close in on it. And then we're down onto Bramham Straight, back down towards the start finish. As I said, it's quite ripply and bumpy here and the bike's quite active. And if you're running, obviously, a stock bike with the traction light, what you'll notice is the traction light is on all the time around here. Because of the bumps, you're getting a lot of wheel spin. No drift out curve on the left. So as you're passing the marshal's post, again, we talked about vision. We want to be looking right the way down. Look for these buildings here, but basically start to look for where the start-finish line. Don't be looking here. Because if that's where your vision is, that's basically where you're going to end up going, and we don't want to really be there. And as the straight opens up, you can tell by the speed here, as we're passing the marshal's post, we're doing 140 plus miles an hour with the bike pretty much at full lean. You've got the thing well heeled over. Because of the bumps, it's a particularly exciting part of the course, even though effectively we're just coming onto the straight. And that's it, the run to the line, across the start-finish line to start yet another lap. I hope you've enjoyed that, and thanks for visiting Racers360.com. And what we'll do now is we'll have a run round the circuit at normal speed to see what it looks like at pace.